right. Um, Good evening. Nice to be actually having class again after I guess almost a month that we didn't have class for one reason or another. And then I realized in looking at the calendar that we will have class next week and then miss 2 weeks again. So at any rate, so we decided to look at the Shir Shel Yom, the daily psalm, first, and then once we get through the daily psalms, we'll go back and we'll look at the Kabbalat Shabbat psalms, and then after that, we can figure out, whether we want to continue with psalms, and if so, a certain category or whatever other organizing principle makes sense. And if not, we can move on to something else. Um, but um, I'm actually grateful for this opportunity. There are a couple of reasons. One is that um, there are certain, like, in rabbinical school, the Bible is not really studied like systematically. It's studied more like topically. Um, and so I don't recall like ever having a course in, I mean, I know I didn't have a course in Psalms, but I don't think we even, looked at the Psalms in any of the Bible courses that I did have. And nor did we look at the Shir Shel Yom in the liturgy class that I had. I mean, I was familiar with it, right? Because I daven, and at the end of the service every day, you have the Shir Shel Yom. And then a few years ago, we started introducing the psalm for the next day at the end of weekday services, right? So I've seen them, but um, I never really had any sense of why these particular psalms were chosen, and how they relate to the particular day of the week. I mean, so I did do a little bit of looking at that question, and what is pretty clear, right? I mean, if you look at um, so uh, I'm not, I think so. If you have the weekday Siddur, the Psalm for Sunday is on page 85. If you have the full Siddur, it's on page 22. And if you have the Shabbat only Siddur, I'm not sure. I have to admit, I'm not sure what page that would be on. But I don't know if anybody, but so it does say before each psalm, right? Hayom Yom Rishon b'Shabbat Shabo Hayu Halivim Omrim Bevet Hamikdash. Today is literally Yom Rishon, means the first day, but Sunday. So the first day of the week, on which the Levites would recite this psalm in the temple. Okay, and it is pretty clear that that is accurate, right? That they did actually recite or chant or sing the psalm of the day as recorded in later literature. And that's reflected contemporaneously. I mean, I remember one time studying the question of why Rosh Hashanah is 2 days, even in Israel, and without like getting into all the details, but they used to proclaim the new moon by actual visual interpretation, and then in a certain year the witnesses came, but they came like fairly late after the service in the temple had been going on for a while. And since Rosh Hashanah hadn't been proclaimed, the Levites chanted the wrong psalm. I mean, it wasn't the wrong psalm at the time. They chanted the regular psalm for the day rather than the psalm for Rosh Hashanah, because Rosh Hashanah hadn't been like proclaimed until after they had already chanted the psalm. So at that point, they put in a rule that that they would only accept witnesses early in the day, so that wouldn't happen again. But the import is that they actually did recite these psalms as it's recorded in the Mishnah and the Talmud. But there's nothing like contemporaneous that says this is why we chose this particular psalm for this particular day. Okay. And so before I go over that sort of briefly, does anybody have any thoughts as to, how these Psalms got selected, or why a particular Psalm on a particular day? Anyone? Okay, yeah, Rabbi Goldman.
I I never thought about it, but the Talmud does tell us that the gates wouldn't open for Solomon. So maybe the first day of the week is when it says Seu Shechem would be very appropriate because he had to basically pray or beg for those gates to open. But I
Right.
never thought about the question the way you just posed it. So
Yeah, I mean, it is right. It is definitely talking about the gates of I mean, even if we, I mean, so this is ascribed to David, right? I mean, the fact that it's ascribed to David, forgive me this minor heresy, doesn't mean that it was actually written by David. But if we assume that it was written by David, then the temple didn't even exist at the time, right? But it is definitely about, you know, crowning God as king, right? But so I did find a couple of articles dealing with this particular question, and um basically all right, so um right, so the Mishnah in Masechet Tamid tells us which is the psalm for which day. But once the temple was destroyed, it wasn't like universally considered obligatory to continue to recite these psalms. And as late as the 12th century, Maimonides said that this is a practice of some of the people. In other words, he didn't consider it obligatory. Um, but the Talmud in Masechet Rosh Hashanah says that the first, so this is Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Akiva. The first six Psalms recapitulate the events of the week of creation as described in the first chapter of Genesis. And then it gets up to, Shabbat. And obviously, I mean, the Psalm for Shabbat, right, is the only one where it does it. It says Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, right? Psalm for Shabbat. But the other ones, like in the Psalm itself, doesn't say the Psalm of Sunday, the Psalm of Monday, right? Um, but sometimes it's a little bit strained to connect a particular psalm to the particular day of the week. But that's Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Akiva. But other scholars, Rabbi Reuven Hammer, in his commentary on the weekday Siddur says that there's not necessarily any connection to that day. Um, and then another Rabbi Miriam Glazer says that this is actually like kind of a cheshbon hanefesh, that it calls upon us to look um, internally, right? But if you so, let's look at the psalm for Sunday. Um, and here, I mean, I'm not even going to play the game and say guess why. I mean, this is pretty obvious, right? I mean, according to Genesis, right? So if Shabbat is the seventh day, right, then Sunday is the first day, right? The first day of creation was Sunday. And this psalm, right, it begins, right? Ladonai haaretz umlo'ah, right? Um, the earth and all that it contains belong to Adonai, right? So that's clearly connected to creation, right? The earth and all it contains belong to Adonai. Tevel v'yoshveva, the world and its inhabitants. All right, Kihu al Yamim Yisada, he founded it or upon the seas, Va'al Neharot Yehonaneha, and established it firm upon the flowing waters. Okay, so um, immediately, right, aside from the assertion that the world belongs to God, right? Not only the world, but everything in the world belongs to God. Why does it belong to God?
because God founded it.
Yeah, right. In other words, he created it, right? He created it, so it belongs to him, right? And at the very beginning of our study of Psalms, I introduced this concept of parallelism, right? That the hallmark of biblical poetry is not certainly not rhyme. It's not meter. It's parallelism. Right now, later commentators would take two phrases that are, just sort of poetically parallel and try to distinguish, well, what's the difference between them, right? And obviously, there's a difference between seas and rivers and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, right, it's really parallelism, right? God established the world on the water, right? Which, I mean, that's what, right? That's what we see in the first chapter of Genesis, right? Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et ha'aretz v'ha'aretz hayta tov v'vohu ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim, right? The Spirit of God hovered above the face of the water, right? Which, also tells us that the biblical concept of creation, it's not ex nihilo, right? It's not yesh ma'ayin. It's not, right? There was nothing and then there was something, right? There was already something, right? There was water, right? But that creation in the Bible is imposition of form or structure on pre-existing matter. Okay, which means that even though is the year 5786. It is not heresy to believe that the universe is actually billions of years old. Um, and you know that the material of the universe was around for a long time before God imposed structure on it, right? Or um, yeah. So Rabbi Goldman.
I just wanted to add that our blessing in the morning is Rokaha Haaretz Alamayim. So that confirms that idea that the Mayim was already there, and we bless Hashem for making a dry land available for us. So
Right. And Rakah is like to, I don't know how you say it, but it's like,
and firmament is the
yeah,
word for
Rakia is a
rakia. So
firmament, right? We
yeah.
translate a Hebrew word that we don't know what it means by an English word that we don't know what it means. Um, but that's right. It's like God, sort of. I see it as like rolled out, right? That God rolled out the land on the water, right? So that's what the process was. Um, but then we have quite a leap. We have quite a leap, right? So we talk about God um, establishing the world, dry land on the water, right? And then we go, Mi Ya'aleh Bahar Adonai, who shall ascend the mountain of the Lord? Umi Yakum Bimkom Kodsho, who may rise in his holy place or in his sanctuary, right? So who can go up to God's mountain? Naki Hapayim Uvar Levav, the one who has clean hands and a pure heart. Asher lo nasa l'shav nafshi, who has not used God's name in false oaths. Velo nishba lemirma, and who has not sworn deceitfully. Right. So that's the person who can go up to God's mountain, to God's sanctuary. Um, First question: do you see any connection between the first couple of verses and then what we just read? Right? I mean, how do we get from the land being established above the floodwaters to ascending to the mountain of the Lord?
Like
Well,
Noach.
he said, yeah,
Hmm?
he said it firmly. He said it firm. Well, I'm reading the English translation. On flowing water. So that means the solid is on the water, and you're going to have a mountain. This formation of a mountain.
Right. I mean, I see it as like a sort of continual process,
Yeah,
right? I mean, you've got the water, and then you've got the lowlands, right? And then you've got the mountains, right? And the
Right.
you
That's
know, and
that's why I
then
asked about Noach because the only way that humanity and the animal kingdom could be saved was when they rested upon a higher realm of the mountain.
right, right. Yeah, although I mean, I'm not sure that this um is referring specifically to Noah. I mean, it could be, or it certainly, I mean, wouldn't exclude a reference to Noah, but it's also like it's connected to, I think it's Psalm 15, right, where David talks about himself, as where David modestly talks about himself as having all of these qualities, right? Um, so they're connected. I mean, I think David certainly kind of has himself in mind here, right? But also, what is the mountain of the Lord's house? I mean, it's not just a mountain; it's also like it's Jerusalem, right? Which we'll see in the Psalm for Monday, right? I mean, and because pretty much anywhere, right? I think pretty anywhere in Eretz, if you're going to Jerusalem from anywhere in Eretz Yisrael, you're going up, right? Um, and so that is like it's a spiritual concept, but it's also a physical concept, right? I mean, how do you say the pilgrimage to Jerusalem on the festival on the festival called Aliyah L'Regel, right? Going up on foot, right? So there is, I mean, at least on the biblical level, very little is purely spiritual, right? It is also physical, right? So we talk about ascending to Jerusalem, and that is a spiritual concept, but it's also a, like a literal physical concept, right? To go up to Jerusalem, and even though the temple didn't yet stand, um, in David's time, David is the one who established Jerusalem as the capital, right? And David, right, intended to build the temple in Jerusalem, right? And what did God say when David declared his desire to build the temple? Right? Basically, God said, your intentions are good, right? But you're not the one who's going to build it. Your son Solomon will build it, right? Um, and why? Maybe because David's hands were so bloody, right? I mean, and he did. I mean, he was a warrior, but he also, frankly, I mean, did some things that were not so savory, right? And we have, it's a later concept, right? But right, we know. In fact, and I within the last couple of weeks read a responsum, right? So it's pretty much like established halacha that a kohen cannot participate in duchening in Birkat Kohanim if they've ever killed another person, right? Even if it was accidentally or even if it was justifiable homicide, right? And I read a response recently about the recent war, and if somebody was in the army and killed people in the fighting, could they still Dochen, and what if they thought maybe they had, but they weren't sure? And I was frankly surprised that this rabbi, who's not like a right winger by any, it was Rabbi David Golinkin, who's the head of the Schechter, the conservative rabbinical school in Jerusalem, and he ruled that they could, which kind of surprised me. But David was precluded from building the temple, right? Because his hands were bloody. His hands were bloody. Whereas Solomon, Shlomo, right, means, right? I mean, Shlomo comes from shalom, comes from peace. That Shlomo is the man of peace, right? And the temple is a symbol of peace, not of war. All right. Um, so if you have clean hands and a pure heart, you can go up to God's mountain. Yistav Racha mi et Adonai. This is the type of person who will receive a blessing from the Lord. Utzdaka Elohei Yisho, right? And a just reward from the God of his deliverance, right? Zed Dor Dorshav Mivakshe Fanecha Yaakov Sela, right? Now, what's interesting, I mean, I said that, biblical poetry um, is a little bit different from our contemporary ideas of poetry. But here you really have like a play on words, right? Zed Dor Dorshav, right? Which literally means this is the generation of those who seek him, right? Meaning seek God, right? Dor means a generation, and dorshav, the drosh means to seek, right? So this is the generation of those that seek him, mivakshe fanecha Yaakov Stella, who long for the presence or who seek the presence of the God of Jacob. All right. And now we had like 5 verses, and then it ends with the word Stella. Okay, and now we shift gears again. Se'u sharim rashechem v'hinasu fitchei olam v'yavo melech hakavod. Lift up your heads, O ye gates, and v'hinasu fitchei olam, open wide. Now, pitchei olam, right? What I have, and I'm looking at the old one only because I think, frankly, the in the newer translation, they attempt to avoid like sexist or gendered language, which is certainly praiseworthy, but it kind of obscures the actual meaning of the Hebrew. So he translates like you ancient doors, Pitchei Olam, ancient doors. I've also seen it translated as everlasting doors, but it could also mean, I think, quite accurately be translated as the gates of the world, right? Because olam means like eternity or forever, but it also means the world, right? So pitchei olam could mean the gates of the world, the yavo melech hakavod, and so that the king of glory or the glorious king may come, in other words, may go through these gates. Mizeh melech hakavod, who is the glorious king? Adonai Ezuz v'gibor, Adonai gibor milchama. Right, the Lord of triumph and might, the Lord triumphant in battle, or the hero of war, the hero of battle. Right, so we're going to open the gates because God, the warrior, is going to go through them. Se'u sharim rashechem. Again, right, the same line. Lift your heads, your lintels, O ye gates. Usu'u pitchei olam. Open wide, you ancient doors, or your doors to the world. The Yavo melech hakavod, that the king of glory or the glorious king may come. Me, who's the Melech HaKavod, who is the glorious King, Adonai Tzavaot, the Lord of hosts, he is the glorious King, right? So, right, we have, I think, it seems to me we have three distinct themes here, right? We have God, creating, or not really creating, but not creating exactly. It's forming, right? It's forming the world, right? Imposing order on pre-existing matter. So we have creation, and then we have the idea that you have to have clean hands and a pure heart and not sworn deceitfully if you want to go up to God's holy mountain. And then we have um, a sort of motif of coronation, right? Of coronation of God as the king of the world. Okay, with apologies to Leonardo DiCaprio, right? But it's not Leonardo DiCaprio is not the king of the world. God is, although Leonardo DiCaprio makes more money. Um, but yeah, Leslie.
Okay, what does Lord of the Hosts mean? Well, I mean, I've heard that so many times, but who are the hosts?
Probably the angelic hosts.
Okay.
Yeah. But
Elisha shows his um, arms bearer, the angels all surrounding the city of Samaria to protect them. So I think that's the most vivid image that we have in the Bible of such. Anyway.
yeah, I'm sorry. Could you repeat that again?
Yeah, sorry. Elisha in the Book of Kings,
Yeah.
his arms bearer or whatever attendant is worried that the city is surrounded by the forces of Aram and Israel against him to catch him and execute him. And
Right.
Elisha prays to Hashem and says, "Please show my man, the angels." And he sees the horses and chariots and everything else that's in the heavenly realms. So that's an
Right.
image
So right.
of the tzvaot of Hashem.
Right. So it's the angelic army, really, right? Because Sava, like in modern Hebrew, Sava is the army, right? Sahal Tzava Haganah Israel, the say Israel Defense Forces, but if you want to translate it more literally, the Israel Defense Hosts, right? Um, there are other references to angels, right? There's one where an angel refers to himself as right Sar Tzvaot Hashem, right? The prince of the hosts of God, right? So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the angelic hosts, right? But the idea, and it's in. I mean, I find it interesting, right? Because um, it talks about God as a warrior, right? And you could look at it and you say how militaristic, right? But the whole idea is that God is the warrior, right? Not us, right? Right? I mean, when they're at the shores of the Red Sea, right? What does Moses say to the people, right? Hashem yelachem lachem v'atem tacharishim, right? God will fight for you. Hashem will fight for you. You be silent, right? And like when somebody is murdered, right, particularly in a terrorist act, they're referred to, like, instead of Zichrono Levracha, it's He Yud Dalet, right? Which stands for Hashem Yikom Damo, right? May God avenge his blood, right? And at first, like, you're a nice liberal American Jew, and you might look at that, may God avenge his blood. How, like, barbaric. But the point is, may God avenge his blood, right? Not may we avenge his blood, right? We leave that up to God, right? You can argue about that too, right? I mean, there's a whole, the whole passivism of the diaspora experience, whatever. I mean, but generally, right? I mean, God is a warrior, but God is a warrior, and certainly the idea is that we will only be victorious to the extent that our actions and our will and so on and so forth is aligned with God, right? In other words, right, we'll be victorious if we're righteous. And if we're not righteous, we won't be victorious, right? Yeah, Alan.
Rabbi, in reading what you had in the bulletin today, that each country or different groups read into holidays things that are significant to them. I think there's a lot of that here. David, although he started out as a shepherd and he didn't go to West Point, he became a warrior as they had it in those days, and he was a king with the political and the trappings of royalty. So his perspective was that of somebody who had fought, and his perspective was the trappings of power. And that's how he sees the Almighty, and that's the prism through which he describes how we should understand the Almighty.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've said a couple times in the last couple of weeks in my dress show, and I mean, it's a little bit flippant and even a little bit heretical, but I think it's nevertheless true that as much as God created us in his image, we also create God in our image, right? I mean,
It's like the story of the four men and the elephant, and each one touched a different place on the elephant, and they, thought differently, but it was actually all one.
right. Well, but I mean, the all one part, yeah, I mean, absolutely, in terms of the four men and the elephant, right? But I'm not, I have to say that the God of Charlie Kirk does not resemble my God at all, right? the Pope's God, you know, bracketing the idea that the God that the Pope believes in was allegedly incarnated in the flesh of Jesus and all, right? But to me, and I have to say, I mean, right, I mean, the stuff that these people think that God is in favor of, right? But then they could look at us and say exactly the same thing, right? What do you mean God supports a woman's right to choose, right? What do you mean that God supports two men or two women being able to marry each other, right? I mean, so I mean, very few people, particularly people who believe themselves to be religious, walk around saying, I know God supports this, but I oppose it, right? Or I know God opposes it, but I support it, right? We all convince ourselves that what we're in favor of, God is also in favor of. And what we're against, God is also against, right? So I think Alan's point, it is, it is very much on target. I mean, and not to mention, I mean, I mean, Samuel told David that he was anointed of God, right? It's not just that David sort of, there was this battle and this scramble for power, and David wound up on top. And then, he saw God in terms of, like, his own kingship, right? I mean, he was anointed by God, right? I mean, that, right? Mashiach, right? Al Yedei David Mashiach Tzidkecha, right? David, your righteous anointed one, right? And the word Mashiach, I mean, it only much later came to have this sort of supernatural connotation, right? But Mashiach means anointed, right? And as far as I know, the first person in the Bible referred to as Mashiach was David, right? He was anointed because that's how kings were inaugurated. They were anointed, right? Having said that, look, I mean,
I think David said about Shaul that he was anointed.
right, yes,
Sorry.
right, right. Right, and then that mandate was taken away from Shaul and given to David, right? But when the people go to Samuel and they say, we, give us a king, right? Samuel's not happy about it, not happy about it at all, right? But what does God say to Samuel? He says, it's not you they've rejected, right? It's me they've rejected, right? Because the original idea was that God would be like the actual king. And to have now a king of flesh and blood is a rejection of that concept. It's a rejection of God, right? But anyway, I mean, and I so right, so I see three distinct themes here. I'm not sure how they're connected. And I'm not saying that as a sort of teaching tool. I really don't see how they're connected. And if anybody has a thought on that, I'd certainly welcome hearing.
Not on that necessarily, but I do think it's interesting that the reference is specifically to Jacob's deity.
Yeah.
I guess He being the patriarch who we most want to emulate, or who was identified with Israel. You
Right. Well, I mean, so Jacob is the father of the tribes, right? Jacob is the father of the tribes, and he's also of the patriarchs. I mean, and this is somewhat anachronistic, obviously, right? But um, Jacob's sons are all, I'm going to say Jews, even though that term is anachronistic, right? I mean, Abraham has two sons, right? Isaac and Ishmael. Only Isaac is a Jew, right? Ishmael goes off and founds Islam, right? And then Isaac has Jacob and Esau, and Esau goes. I mean, and it's clearly, I mean, in the forget about the midrashic connection of Esau with with Rome and then Christianity. All right, that's clearly midrashic, right? But it's certainly clear, in later generations that Esau, Edom, the Edomites, they are our cousins, but they're our cousins. They're not our brothers, right? Whereas Jacob has, the tribes of Israel are Jacob's sons, and none of them has gone off in a different direction, right? And of course, and Jacob is also Yisrael,
That's
right?
right.
And so, clearly, I mean, by the time of the Psalms, um, that Yisrael is the name of the people. It's not just the name. It doesn't mean just Jacob, right? So we are more the Jacobites than the Abrahamites or the Isaacites. So yeah. All right.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
and this, I know this sort of sounded familiar. This psalm was also selected as what we sing returning the Torah during the weekday service.
During weekdays. Yeah.
Yeah, and I found that it's interesting because I can see the relation, the choice with towards the glory, praising God as you're returning it.
Yeah, sure. Sure. And it is also, I mean, a few years ago, and he was talking about really the psalm that we say on Shabbat when we're returning the ark, but I think it applies to this psalm as well, that it is clearly a coronation psalm.
Yeah.
Okay. And um that we are crowning God as the king, and Professor Benji Summer from JTS showed parallels between and stuff that certainly I can't do, but a Bible scholar, especially a Psalm scholar, they'll know Ugaritic and Canaanite and so on and so forth, and they'll see parallels between this and stuff in those other Semitic languages, right? And that when we parade the Sefer Torah through the crowd, right? It's like the king coming around, right? And being greeted by the people, which is one of the reasons why I don't personally like it when whoever is carrying the Torah, like, I think you should sort of go in a circle and not deviate, and that people should come to the Torah and
Mhm.
not the Torah be brought I mean, I understand there's a certain sort of compassionate reason for doing that for somebody who has limited mobility, but other than somebody having limited mobility, right, they really should come to the top, right? I
Why
mean, it's
don't you
like
why don't you say that? Why don't you tell people they don't know that?
I could, I suppose. Yeah. I also don't like to embarrass people, right? And say, what you've been doing for the last 14 years is actually wrong.
Well, you
Um,
could say it. You don't have to say that, but you should tell no, because that's part of learning. It's
I
like
mean,
it's like people don't know not to look at the Birkat Kohanim.
right.
They don't know it, so you should teach them. They would
Yeah. All right.
appreciate it.
Yeah, good point. Good point. All right. No, I hear you. I hear you. Um, but that again, I mean, that's just like I say, but particularly if it is really like a replication of a sort of coronation, right? I mean, like, when when the king is walking through the crowd, right? People come, they approach the king and
Right.
not the other way around. Okay. Well, we did one whole psalm, so that's not bad. Rather than do uh like another line or so of another psalm in the 6 minutes we have left, I think we'll call, but I will give homework. I mean, over the next couple of weeks, look over these and see if you can, right? Because in the, like I said, in the Talmud, it does say that the psalm of each day is connected to what happened on that day of creation in Genesis 1. So see if you can
Okay.
see that connection, right? Sometimes that connection is apparent, and sometimes that connection is not at all apparent. Okay. So thank you, and Shabbat Shalom.
Rabbi, thank you.
Not
It's good
shalom and
Yeah,
seeing
thank
thanks.
you.
Marcia.
Thank
Marcia,
you.
you can keep on
Marcia,
coming to our
continue,
session.
Marcia.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
Yes, it was nice to have
Yeah.
you.
How,
Hi, Marcia.
right.
nice to be able to join you.
Yeah. How cold is it in Chicago?
Well, actually, it's in the 20s, but we've had some cold weather. And
Yeah.
actually, this is the beginning of my fifth winter here, which is hard to believe.
Wow.
Yesterday was the fourth anniversary of my moving into this apartment.
Wow.
But the previous 4 winters have been very mild. And boy, we've
Uh-huh.
had a lot of snow so far. So it looks like this winter is going to be more like what I remember.
Yeah, I mean the first time I was in Chicago was December 1985 for a Georgetown DePaul basketball game, and I
Aha.
had never been so cold in my entire
I
life,
can well
right?
imagine.
And then that evening my brother, my dad, and I, we went downtown for dinner, and it was like 90 degrees below zero and a
And how was the
200
wind?
mile an hour
And how
wind
was the
kind of
wind
blowing
blowing?
200 miles an hour. It was just like unbelievable, right? And then the next time I was in Chicago was about 10 years later in February for a job interview. And I was met at the airport by somebody that I knew, and it was beautiful. It was like in the 50s. It was sunny, and it was like 55 degrees. And she says, "Oh, it's always like this in the winter in
Oh,
Chicago."
yeah.
And I said, yeah, no, I've been here in the winter
Well,
before.
it's going to be
This is
very
not
cold.
my first time in Chicago in the winter.
It was
So
enough.
no.
Well, I had a colleague at NIH who was looking to move. He was in the commission corps, 20 years or up.